people popped up, Tulsi kept me as a supporter because of her consistency and her principles. As we get ready to vote in about 48 hours here in New Hampshire, I want to thank you all for coming out and considering Tulsi. I hope that tonight you hear what I heard about a year ago and she wins you over as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tulsi Gabbard.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Aloha. Brian is not only one of our amazing volunteers, but he is a fellow veteran, and I'm so grateful to him for his service and the voice that he brings throughout this campaign, but really pointing to a lot of the important issues that we're most concerned about. And so I just want to start by asking any of our veterans, military spouses, or family members, if you would please stand and just thank you, along with Brian, for your service. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you all so much. You know, it's important as we hear the increasing noise in our political environment that we all kind of stay centered in what this is all about. You know, this country that we love, who we are as Americans, and the great service and sacrifice of so many patriots across generations that really define, I think, the best of who we are. This is what inspires me every single day, even with obstacles and challenges that are placed before us, to not be disheartened, but instead to really look forward and to remember where the power and the energy for change really exists. It lies within every one of our hands and our hearts. Abraham Lincoln gave a speech about 162 years ago where he sounded a warning call all across the country at that time, saying that a house divided against itself cannot stand. That same warning call applies to us now today as much as it did to people in that time, given how divided our country has become, sadly. It's something that I hear most often about as we're holding our town halls here across New Hampshire, as people are stopping me in the street and just expressing this frustration that, you know, how do we bridge these divides? How do we get back to a place where our country is not about us versus them, one group against the other, whether it's based on political differences, political affiliations, race or religion or orientation or any of these other things? How do we get back to a place where we stand united as Americans? And worse yet, sometimes the question is, can we? Is it possible? Because it's hard to see that light as in the world that we live in today. Not only is it possible, we have to make it happen. And at the end of that speech that Abraham Lincoln gave, the words that are less famous than his whole point of that speech, but just as important, is he said, "We shall not fail." We, that's all of us. We shall not fail. He said, if we stand fast, we shall not fail. And to me, that's really the choice that every one of you as voters has to make. Because your vote is such a powerful thing. Yes, your vote is an exercise of your voice, about issues that you care about the kind of leadership that you'd like to see in our country. But really, it is a powerful message. And so thinking about what kind of message you want to send to Washington, what kind of message you want to send to the government of, by, and for the powerful elite that we have now, that is unfortunately leaving behind so many Americans. That's really the decision point that you have before you, especially as first in the nation primary. Overcoming these divides, treating each other with respect as fellow Americans is how we make this happen. I want to begin here by helping us all here get to know each other a little bit. So you can help me out with this. Raise your hand if you're a Democrat. Registered or not, whatever. However you identify, that's cool. All right. Thank you. You can put your hand out. If you are Republican, raise your hand. Awesome. Thank you for being here. If you are independent or libertarian, raise your hand. Wow. Thank you. This right here, if you had a chance to look around the room a little bit, to me represents the political diversity in our country. And this is something I've really appreciated for all the time that we've spent here in New Hampshire, is that this is a place where we can come together and we can treat each other with respect. We'll have a dialogue, we'll open it up for some questions and answers, listen to each other, maybe hear some perspectives that we hadn't considered or heard from before. And know that we, even in spite of the different ideas or solutions that we have to the problems we face, we stand united knowing that we are rooted in our Constitution. We are motivated by love for our country and a care for our future. And therefore, we can and will find a way to take the best of these ideas and actually solve the problems that we're facing. I think all Americans want a fresh new generation of leadership, a fresh perspective to these challenges and problems that it seems like we hear the same thing election after election after election. I know when I started out this campaign and was preparing for some of the initial debates, I was going through and watching previous presidential debates, and it really struck me that, you know, whether it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago or 12 or 16 years ago, so many of the questions being asked of candidates were exactly the same as the questions being asked now. In many ways, a lot of the dialogue around the answers touched a lot of the same themes and notes, which is a real problem because it means we're not making the kind of progress that we need to make in this country to the point where we're actually solving problems and maybe having to address new ones, actually understanding the root cause of these problems and having leaders in Washington who put country first, bring their different ideas, make compromise where necessary to be able to start to move our country forward. So the key to how we bridge these divides is literally happening and starting in this room here today. Yeah, it's us. It's all of us. This is where it starts. Yes, casting your vote here on Tuesday is the absolute necessary first step to make sure your voice is heard, to make sure your message is sounded loud and clear to Washington, that we stand united as Americans first. But it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there. It requires continued engagement. And this is something that's important to me, where as president, in the same way that we've had a chance to get across New Hampshire, get across other states in the country, to have this kind of dialogue, it's important to continue this conversation. Yes, with leaders in Congress from across both party lines, but to continue this connection where you know you have the ear of your leaders. I've been frustrated. I've seen how often during election time you'll see your local political leaders, but then once the election is done, then you don't see them until the next 4 years rolls around. This is a big problem because Washington is so disconnected from the reality of the everyday lives that Americans live across the country. So bridging this divide needs to happen in Washington, but it also needs to happen across the country. And this is my personal commitment to every one of you, that as president, I will have your back. I will treat every American with respect. I'll be open to listening to different perspectives maybe other than my own, so that we as Americans can make the best decisions for our country, for our future, and for generations to come. Because we've gone too long for having leaders in Washington who are only interested in listening to people who agree with them, and not open to hearing any views that maybe differ from their own. How terrible would this country be if we all only thought the same thing and walked in the same steps and voted the exact same way? That's not who we are as a country. We've got to get back to a place where we celebrate the diversity of our ideas. And that when someone disagrees, the answer is not "you're canceled," "delete your account," as the kids say on Twitter these days. How many of you are on Twitter? I'm just curious. All right, all right. For me, thank you. Thank you for being our Twitter warriors. I appreciate it. It's gotten to a point now, and I've experienced this and continue to experience this firsthand, where people will say, "Tulsi, I won't support you because you go on Fox News." Or people judge others based on what cable news channel they happen to watch. This is where we've become. This is what we've become. I know, it's crazy. It's crazy. But this is the problem. And look, cable news is a whole other conversation. I have a hard time watching any of them, but a lot of people do. A lot of people do, and I'll go on every platform possible because I'm not only running for president to lead the viewers of MSNBC. I'm asking for your trust to serve every single American as your president and commander-in-chief, not just those of my own party. And this is the beauty of New Hampshire. And the beauty of the coalition of support that we've been able to build here, reflected in this room. That we have the support of Democrats, independents, libertarians, and Republicans coming together and saying, hey, we're gonna put country first. We're gonna put country first and send this resounding message to Washington that enough is enough. Now is the time that we bring about a government that is truly of, by, and for the people. This is our time. Now, before we'll open it up to some Q&A, I'll try to get to as many questions and hear your thoughts as possible. But I just want to ask if we could send our good thoughts and send a prayer to the loved ones of the service members who were killed and injured in Afghanistan yesterday. Just take a moment together, please. Thank you. We still have men and women who are putting their lives on the line because they took an oath to serve our country as we gather here today. It is endlessly frustrating to me, just as an individual, as a soldier, as a veteran of 2 deployments to the Middle East, that the qualifications and experience required to serve as commander-in-chief are not at the forefront of so many of the debates and discussions that are happening, so that you as voters can make your best informed decision, when this is really the most important responsibility the president has. Foreign policy is domestic policy. My brothers and sisters in uniform are continuing to pay the price. Their families, their loved ones are continuing to pay the price, making that ultimate sacrifice because of decisions of politicians in Washington, many of whom have no idea what it means to either be willing to lay your life down for our country or they don't know what it means to be a husband or wife or a child at home with a loved one deployed, anxious and stressed every single day, that you may get that knock on the door. Lives are at stake. There are very real consequences to the decisions that our commander-in-chief makes and the decisions that leaders in Congress make. And it's important for all of you, for us as a country, to really think about this carefully, given we just lost 2 more lives in Afghanistan yesterday. The families of those lost should not be having to ask themselves the question, what was this sacrifice for? Every one of our men and women in uniform, all of us, we take that oath to be willing to lay our lives down to protect the safety, security, and freedom of the American people. We've got to stop dishonoring that willingness to sacrifice all for our country by stopping sending our troops needlessly into harm's way, fighting regime change wars that do not make our country any safer. This is where experience matters. Experience, understanding, and foresight in national security and foreign policy. To know that your next commander-in-chief is not going to walk in green, is not going to walk in and be faced with immediate decisions and having to look to the foreign policy establishment, the military-industrial complex, these people who hold great power and influence in Washington over both political parties, to say, hey, tell me what I should do. I was alarmed by some of the answers in the debate the other night coming from some of the candidates that really exposed that lack of understanding, that lack of the ability to be able to make the best decisions possible for our country's national security and our troops, just because you don't have that experience. So yes, we need a fresh new generation of leadership, a new perspective, but that must come with experience. Experience for you to know, for you to have the peace of mind that our next president will walk in on day one prepared to fulfill that responsibility as commander-in-chief. That you will have the peace of mind and the confidence to know that your next president will have the experience to be able to get things done, to be able to work with Congress, whichever political party happens to be in charge of the House or the Senate. I have both. I have the experience of having worked in Congress now for 7 going on 8 years, really focused on national security and foreign policy, working on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services and Homeland Security Committees, working for the first 6 of those years as a Democrat with a Republican majority, and actually being able to pass legislation and get things done. And I have that experience of serving as a soldier, literally having my boots on the ground. Still serving now in the Army National Guard for almost 17 years, deploying twice to the Middle East, first time during the height of the war in 2005. We're in a medical unit every single day. We were all confronted with that terribly high human cost of war, confronted with the loss of our friends, confronted with that reality of how fragile life is, and therefore not taking lightly these decisions that will be made. You will have the peace of mind knowing that as your president and commander-in-chief, I will end these wasteful regime change wars, that I will work to end this new Cold War and nuclear arms race that we are in, and instead use diplomacy, focus on a foreign policy based on cooperation rather than conflict. Only send our troops into harm's way if it is necessary for the safety and security of our nation, and redirect our taxpayer dollars away from needlessly being wasted, as they are now, and instead invest them in serving the needs of our people and communities right here at home. And this is... Here's the direct impact of this. I often remind folks that foreign policy is domestic policy. So if you're not a family that's personally or directly been impacted by the cost of war, if you don't have a veteran in your family, the reality is every one of us is paying the price. In Afghanistan right now, even though the Afghanistan papers that were released recently have shown that leaders in our own government for the last 3 administrations have been questioning, why are we even there? Victory is not defined and not within reach. So what are we even doing there? Yet we are still having troops who are dying in combat. And we have $4 billion coming out of our pockets going to prop up a corrupt government in Afghanistan and continue this war that our own leaders are saying, what are we doing? We shouldn't be wasting our money or people's lives there. $4 billion a month. That's $5.5 million per hour. Per hour. So for, hour and a half or 2 hours that we're gathered here today, that's 11 million bucks. How many teachers do we have here in the room? Thank you for your service, first of all. But imagine what we could do in your classrooms with a fraction of that amount of money. Imagine what kind of paraprofessionals we could get in to help make sure that kids who need help get the help and service they need. Imagine what we could do with that money to help folks in places like Merrimack here in New Hampshire who are suffering because their water is contaminated with this forever chemical called PFAS, just to be able to get clean water. Imagine what we could do with those resources to better protect our environment, to make sure these beautiful places we get to call home are preserved, not just for us, but for generations to come. When you really look at being responsible with our taxpayer dollars and how even as politicians time and time again will tell you there's not enough money for education, not enough money for healthcare, not enough money for infrastructure, for clean water, for climate change, the list goes on, but then all of a sudden there's a blank check to go and wage these wasteful regime change wars, to go and build more nuclear weapons because of treaties that have been torn up, weapons that were previously banned under the INF Treaty, for example, negotiated by Reagan and Gorbachev. That's all right. We're going to go spend a few trillion more dollars to go build these weapons that actually make us less safe. An endless amount of money. Who pays the price? We do. Who profits? The people making those weapons. And for what? That is the question we should all be asking our leaders, because this is our money, it is our country, it is our families, our loved ones, our brothers and sisters, and it's our future. Now is the time we take the stand to determine our future and not allow those in Washington who are more interested in their power or their money or their selfish interests to make decisions that harm those we love and the country that we love. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for standing with me in bringing about this change. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. So good seeing you all here today. All right, we've got a couple of microphones. We're gonna try to, you might have to help pass them down the line. Yes, ma'am, we'll start with you. Just hold on for the microphone. We wanna make sure everybody can hear.
Hi, I'm asking for my grandchild.
Would you mind,
Hi,
are you able to stand? Awesome.
My granddaughter asked me to ask you what you will be doing about climate change.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And thank your granddaughter for passing on the question. How old is she? 9 years old, amazing. I'm impressed, but also sad that this is something that she's thinking about, really. This is not something that our 9-year-old kids should really have to be concerned about in their future. This is an issue that unfortunately has become a polarizing issue in Washington, like so many others, when there's no need for it, because we all have a shared interest in protecting ourselves and this planet from the environmental threats that we face. And that's really where we can get past the polarization and the politicizing of this issue and really focus on how do we bring about change? How do we bring about solutions to these threats, to the most precious things we need to survive? So I start with the most basic things. You know, we've got to make sure that we have clean water to drink, that we have clean air to breathe, you know, that we are preserving these beautiful spaces that we get to call home. And there are a few main approaches that we need to take here at home to do that. One that gets talked about most often is about transitioning off of fossil fuels and really investing in and ushering in a new green renewable energy economy. There is so much innovation, there is so much opportunity in this area that really creates a win-win-win solution for us all. We are able to better protect our environment. We're able to achieve energy security, where we are more energy independent and we're not having to worry about what is happening in some other country on the other side of the world to determine our energy costs. And it's also a way to stabilize and reduce the cost of energy in this country, making it better on all of our pocketbooks. That's a major area of change that I would seek. The other is in agriculture, though, that doesn't quite get as much attention as it should, given how much the archaic agriculture practices in this country have and are continuing to have a negative impact on our environment, both in polluting water, air, reducing the quality of our soil, making it harder for us to have the confidence that we'll be able to continue to grow food to feed people in this country. We need to take the incentives, the economic incentives that have for so long been put into these monocrops and multinational agribusiness corporations and instead redirect them towards things like sustainable agriculture, regenerative farming, local and regional farmers who are growing food to be able to feed people in their communities or in their regions. By doing this, we can have a dramatic impact on our environment. And the third thing is just recognizing that even as we make these changes in the way we need to here at home, it does not begin to scratch the surface of the global change necessary. And this is, once again, where foreign policy is domestic policy. And where, as president, I will lead with this foreign policy based on cooperation rather than conflict so that we can work out our differences with other countries where they exist, while leaving open this door to be able to coordinate efforts in areas of shared and common interest, of which climate change and the global environmental threats we face is a critical one. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Congresswoman Gabbard, you made a strong case against sending U.S. money to Afghanistan to support a corrupt regime. I'm interested in your thoughts on sending U.S. money to Ukraine to support a corrupt regime there.
Good question. I had supported in Congress providing defensive and non-weapons related support to the people of Ukraine who are fighting against the incursion across their borders from Russia. I think we have to be very clear-eyed about the money that we're spending, whether it's there or in any other country, about how it is furthering the interests of our country's national security. If we know that our money is just going to prop up corrupt governments and it's not actually going to help people who are in need, then we shouldn't be wasting our taxpayer dollars in that way. Thank you. Here you go.
Thank you.
Stand up, stand up.
Oh, okay. Well, for English, I'm researching the Central Park 5, and it kind of got me down this like rabbit hole of like exonerations and how nearly 70% are people of color, and I was wondering like what you're gonna do to combat that. Because
70% of.
known exonerations are of people of color.
Thank you. How old are you? 14. Awesome. Thank you for being here. I have not yet seen the Central Park 5 film. I think we talked about this last time I saw you, isn't that right? Yeah, I know. I have been a little busy. I haven't had time. I'm sorry. I know it's on Netflix, but it's like sleep or, yeah, I've chosen sleep. Look, I think this points to the bigger issue as we look at some of the unjust elements of our broken criminal justice system and how for too long we've seen people of color, black and brown people, or people who are living in poverty disproportionately negatively impacted by it. And so we've got to get to the heart of that systemic unfair and unjustness within our system to solve these problems. And the problems are oftentimes generationally gone a long way back. So, you know, it's doing things like cash bail reform. It's doing things like enacting real prison reform, getting rid of mandatory minimums, enacting real sentencing reform, and dealing in some cases with the institutional racism that still exists within this criminal justice system in other parts of the country. And lastly, it has to do with ending the failed war on drugs that, once again, has also disproportionately negatively impacted people of color and people who are living in poverty. And we've got to approach this from a very comprehensive perspective and recognize how deeply rooted these issues are so that we can stop kind of tweaking around the edges and thinking that we're actually making an impact, but really get to the heart of the problem.
Thank you. Yes. What's your name?
Nate. Nate.
Hi, Nate. How old are you?
9.
Thanks for being here.
Do you think you have a good shot at being president?
That's a great question, Nate. Do you support me?
I don't know.
Fair enough. Well, that's why we're here, right? This is why I'm here, to be able to help make the case to people who still maybe don't know. The answer to your question is yes. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. But really the most important thing is I know that you are the ones who decide the answer to that question. Too often we see now in this election, and we've seen in previous elections, how you have pundits and pollsters who will pontificate on things and say, well, these are the people who have a shot, these are the people who don't, and they do this for months and months and months and months before anyone even actually goes out to vote. I think it's an unfair thing because it makes people think, well, if these people who seem smart on TV are telling me that this person doesn't have a shot, then maybe I shouldn't vote for them. But that discounts the power of you, of us, as voters, who are really the ones who get to decide that. So this is why I'm not paying attention to what other people are saying. I encourage you to not pay attention to what other people are saying, and instead really truly recognize that it is you and only you who make that decision. Does that answer your question? All right. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Tulsi, what do you think we can do about gun violence in our country? It's such a systemic problem.
Yeah.
And as a soldier, where do you stand on the ownership of guns, and how would you work with this big issue?
Thank you so much. This is probably one of the most polarizing issues in the country that for so long has been relegated to, well, you either support the Second Amendment or you don't. But what I know to be true is that the vast majority of Americans in this country both support the Second Amendment and our constitutional right, and are also concerned about this tragic increase in mass shootings that receive a lot of attention, rightly so, in our media, but people who are also concerned about the reality that does not make the news of children who are killed on the streets of cities like Chicago as they're walking to school. You know, families who are eating dinner around the dinner table in their own home killed because of a drive-by shooting. A friend of mine who is a congresswoman who represents part of Chicago in her district was telling me a few weeks ago how frustrated she is. You know, she takes to the House floor, she delivers speeches, she's trying to bring more attention to the tragic shootings in her district every day. But she said there was a recent headline in their newspaper that had to do with shootings, and it wasn't because there was another shooting, it was because they had gone 48 hours without a shooting. And that was the reason why there was a headline, because usually there's not. This is a much deeper issue that can only be solved when we as Americans come together and recognize that it is not us against them. Something that doesn't really happen now because these conversations don't exist. They're not happening in Washington. Any legislation, even remotely touching the issue of guns, is voted largely along party lines, not bringing us any closer to a solution. And it's fear tactics being used on both sides to further drive this polarization and these wedges between us. But this isn't about Democrats versus Republicans. It's about all of us. And it's about upholding our constitutional rights, which I firmly believe we must do, including our Second Amendment rights. And it's also about us as the American people being able to have the peace of mind that we can send our kids to school and not have to live in fear that that school might be the next target for a mass shooting. That we can go and worship in a church or a temple or a mosque and not have to live in fear that that place of worship may be the next target. There are deeply rooted issues in this country that we've got to come together to address. Legislation, things like universal background checks, closing the Charleston loophole that had to do with the shooting in South Carolina. There are other pieces of sensible legislation where I believe there is great opportunity for bipartisanship if we get past the hyperpartisanship and the hyperbole and really just focus on where is there common ground to be had, while also really getting to the deeper issues that maybe legislation can't solve, but that we as a society have to tackle with. I think that's the biggest issue here with the dialogue around gun violence, is that it's not getting us anywhere because there's not enough listening, there's not enough openness, that people are feeling like they have to be on attack. But really, it's about all of us, and it's about our lives and the lives of those that we love.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Like your
Aloha, Major Gabbard.
Aloha. Oh, I'm just seeing your flag there.
Would you be receptive to a third political party, one that was perhaps oriented to and by veterans?
Interesting.
Of course. Of course. I think that in our democracy, there should be an openness or a viability for those seeking to form a party, whether it's of veterans or based on other interests. I think the problem that we have now is that the two-party system doesn't really allow for that because of how much power and how much money is centralized in the national political parties. Note, I said national, because I was vice chair of the DNC for 3 years, and I heard so often complaints and concerns and frustrations coming from the local state parties or local county parties who don't get the kind of support they need, and how they're largely ignored until like two months out from election day. Then it's like, all right, hey, here's what we need you guys to do. And they're like, come on, we need help. We need resources. We've been trying to do this work, but so much of the money and power is centralized in the national headquarters of both political parties that creates a disproportionate level of influence both on elected leaders to think that they have to toe the party line or else the party won't support them, rather than voting based on their conscience and what's in the best interest of the country. And effectively being able to shut out any kind of viable third party from really standing up and representing a unique constituency within this country. I think that we need veterans from all generations stepping up to serve and lead in this country at every level of government more than we have now. Because we're seeing, and this is with both parties, because we're seeing the difference now. You know, when I ran for Congress, I think it was 11% of members of Congress had ever worn the uniform, contrasting with not so long before when we had many World War II and Vietnam veterans serving at a point where it was like 65, 70% of members of Congress had worn the uniform. And you see the contrast. I worked for Senator Akaka, who's a World War II veteran from Hawaii. When he was chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee, I was a legislative aide for a couple of years between my two deployments. And at that time, you saw the kind of civility and relationships between senators who would argue, maybe strongly on the Senate floor, on different issues that they disagreed on, but would ultimately, you know, their families would have dinner at night, and they'd be able to find a way to work through problems that they were debating on that Senate floor. Contrast that with what we have today, where there's less and less a sense of, in spite of our differences, we have to put country first. And instead it is more about which party can either gain power or keep power or try to get the power back that they lost. So that heart and sense of service and commitment to our country that exists within every veteran ultimately is what we need to bring back. I've worked with a colleague of mine, Congressman Brian Mast. He's a Republican from the state of Florida. We have and are continuing to work together on a number of issues. Even as we maybe vote differently on a lot of issues, there's a lot of things that we're working together on as veterans because we understand that this is about putting country first.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I have a question. Let's say you don't win. Would you consider a VP role if Bernie wins, or any other position like state secretary?
I'm focused on winning. Thank you. Thank you for your question, but we're focused on what all of you will decide on Tuesday here on Election Day. I'll be on a plane very quickly after that to head to South Carolina, where we'll continue to spread the message of the kind of leadership that I seek to bring. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Last question.
Right here in the red shirt.
Hi, Tulsi. I have
Hi.
another VP-related question. Given the diversity of support that your campaign has drawn, does a President Gabbard have an independent or a Republican vice president?
Possibly. Possibly. The things that I'm saying to you about inclusiveness, about us standing together as Americans, is not just campaign rhetoric. It's something I really believe. And so as president, I would look to make the decisions about my cabinet and the people I would surround myself with based on the most important qualification, is that commitment to service. That commitment to service. And then, what experience do you bring? I am inspired by Abraham Lincoln's example of the team of rivals that he built, that he gathered around himself, so that he wasn't just sitting around with people who were yes men or women or just parroting the same things that he was talking about. He wanted to get the benefit of those who were previously political opponents, perhaps, and who were able to argue, you know, have a good back and forth to know that, hey, we are making the best decision for the country. And so that's the same perspective that I would take in looking to choose the cabinet and potential VP to lead our country.
Last question.
Yes, ma'am.
Just to follow up on an earlier question about gun violence, excuse me, do you support a ban on assault weapons?
I do, and I've co-sponsored legislation to do that. But I'm also just cognizant of where we have to go as a country. And we have a lot of work to do that ultimately has to be centered around those objectives that I talked about earlier. So being able to have those conversations with people who bring a different perspective to pass legislation that will have a very practical impact on helping us achieve those objectives, I think is the most important thing we need to do to establish this foundation for positive change. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, we'll get to you. It'll be our last question.
As you know, in New Hampshire, we have a big issue with the opioid epidemic,
Yes.
and I wanted to know what you thought the government's role is in that, holding pharmaceutical companies accountable, and yeah, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This is unfortunate that this issue is less and less in the news these days, given how much this epidemic is continuing to ravage so many people's lives and communities across the country. There are 130 Americans every day who are losing their lives because of the opioid epidemic. 130 Americans. It's an astounding number. And I believe it is around 40% of those whose addiction began with a basic prescription for Oxycontin or oxycodone or some other highly addictive opioid. Yes, as president, I will hold those responsible accountable, whether it's big pharma companies like Purdue Pharma, or it is the doctors or pharmacists who are abusing their position of responsibility to proliferate these drugs on our streets. That accountability must be there to prevent this from continuing. The second thing, though, is really dedicating the kinds of resources necessary to help those who are struggling with addiction. I think this also falls into the larger category of the failed war on drugs, where we need to see substance abuse and addiction as a true healthcare issue in our country, rather than one that is just relegated to a broken criminal justice system that's not actually helping people. The third thing is really recognizing how, even as we were able to help people, and I've talked with a lot of people in recovery since I've been here in New Hampshire, some who are sober now for 3, 4, and 5 years, but who are still struggling. And the thing that they shared is, while they have been able to go for as long as they have through this recovery, start to begin to put their lives back together, they have shared how important it is that we don't just look at the symptom, but we really get to the root cause. There's a gentleman who I spoke to who shared his own story. He was working in the corporate world, he was making 6 figures, and his whole life completely fell apart because of opioid addiction. He got to a place where he was able to get through it, started a landscaping business, hires people who are also in recovery to help empower them. But what he talked about is that he is still experiencing that internal pain that caused him to abuse those opioids in the first place. And for him, he finds peace in working with plants. Other people find their peace in their treatment through other means. But the key is that we don't just see this solution either as treating this addiction with more drugs or other drugs, but actually help people in the way they need to be helped and deal with the root cause. It's a big issue. It's not easily solved. There's not, hey, here's we're gonna do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because every person is different. But the point is really recognizing that healing process that people need to go through, and frankly, that kids even now are experiencing with different mental health challenges, if we're really serious about bringing about a solution that isn't one that's prescribed by big pharma as an industry. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, sir. Well, you'll be our last. You're going to get me in trouble here soon.
To follow up on a question, first of all, as a 24-year Navy veteran, I want to thank you for the honor, courage, and commitment that you've used in opposing the queen of all what we know you had said earlier. And I want to thank you as someone who constantly and still works in a high security environment that has to maintain a clearance to keep my son fed, my family fed, that would never get the type of pass that the queen of all got. And I want to thank you for your dignity and your honor and courage and commitment in opposing her for that. But I wanted to follow up on the assault weapons question. As a licensed federal firearms dealer, you're talking to people that live in two of the safe. I'm from Maine, unfortunately, for you, but
you can vote for me in Maine.
well, not Tuesday though. But I live in the safest state in the union.
Yeah.
Why should taxpayers in that state have to give up what they see as part of their freedoms and what I see as a deterrent to government tyranny because of a problem that doesn't affect our state? And truly, you and I are qualified on all of those small arms, and we know that they're great platforms for shooting. So how is a failed ban that did not work in the Clinton era going to work when we can do subtle things like connect the NICS database and connect the no-fly list? That's a nuance that nobody would even know about.
Yeah.
It would have saved us. It would have saved 52 people at the Pulse nightclub.
Yeah.
If somebody just said, "You can't fly. Why should you be able to buy a gun?"
Yeah.
There's so many different things that we can do on that level without outright bans and telling people that aren't criminals that if they do something they've done for years, they are.
Yeah. Fair enough. Thank you very much for your service. And thanks for raising these issues, all of them. And I think this is really exactly what I'm talking about, the kind of discussion that we need to have as a country to bring about actual and real solutions. You mentioned the no-fly list, so I just want to comment on that briefly. I agree with you that if we're connecting these databases and we're actually making it so that these background checks really do work, with the no-fly list, we have to make sure it actually is functioning and that there is due process there in place. And this was one of the issues that we've been trying to work on in Congress, is that if you're going to have a no-fly list ban on purchasing firearms, we have to make sure that people who are mistakenly put on the no-fly list because of a typo, or maybe your name is similar to someone else's, that there is due process there for yourself to be able to get off of that no-fly list, and even to know that you're on it in the first place.
But for real quick, my voice carries, don't worry. There's a 72-hour delay already built into the NICS check system that could automatically be flagged if somebody's on the no-fly list that would say, you've got 72 hours to go ask that person on a no-fly list why they're trying to buy a gun, or go find out why.
Yeah.
It doesn't, it's things that are already in place, and it doesn't, you're not saying that they can't buy a gun forever.
Right.
You're just saying, hey, somebody you're saying is a bad guy is trying to buy a gun. Go check it out.
Right. Go check it out. But the issue with the no-fly list, and I've talked to a few people who have been directly negatively impacted by this, they end up on this list for years because they don't know how to get off of it, and they were wrongly put on it in the first place. So even though you're right in getting that up front, we want to make sure that there is that due process in place so their rights aren't needlessly infringed upon, whether it has to do with firearms or it has to do with just basic travel. Yeah, but look, these are all issues that we've got to come together and we've got to have a real dialogue around. Every state has different laws related to firearms. So we've got to talk about what makes sense at a federal level, what makes sense in respecting states' rights. My home state of Hawaii has very different laws than Maine. Hawaii it's much more difficult to purchase a firearm. It's even more difficult to purchase any kind of an M4 or an M16 or whatever it is. We can look at these different models that exist in different states. Hawaii is very different from Maine. We also have some of the lowest gun violence rates in the nation, probably for different reasons, but what people have decided and found in one state, others have decided differently in another state. And so it's finding this balance. I'm not going to stand here and tell you today I know exactly what that should be, because this is something that we've got to come together and really work out and decide as a country.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really sorry. We are unfortunately out of time here. If you are have a burning question, and we have another town hall in Concord. You can come and join us there at 6:30 tonight. We're going to be at the Bank of New Hampshire stage. But I want to just say thank you for taking the time to come and be here today. Time is the most precious thing that any one of you has to give, and appreciate that you've chosen to spend your time here with us. Before you take off, in the last couple of days here of this campaign, I just want to ask Brian to come up here and share what we're doing and how you can help. If you've made up your mind and you're a supporter and you'll be voting, Brian will be able to share with you some of the things that you can do. If you're leaving today still undecided, I still ask you to share the conversation and experience that you've had today with others. Go ahead, Brian.
Hi, everybody, again. So in the back, we have these little pledge cards that we'd ask you to take and fill out if you can. We just ask 5 easy things of you. If you have social media, take 5 minutes, post on social media with the hashtag #StandWithTulsi and tell us why you stand with Tulsi, and encourage some of your friends to do the same. In the back, you can ask about how you can have coffee and toffee with Tulsi. Definitely ask about that in the back. Attend a town hall, which you all are here. We have another one, like Tulsi just said, up in Concord. We have a big red Tulsi truck outside, and we are going to be caravanning there after this. So if you guys are interested and you want to come to that, you don't even need to whip out the GPS. You can just follow us right there. You can be part of volunteer opportunities. I know there's only 2 days left, but there's a whole lot of hard work to do, and we'd really appreciate you asking in the back about how you can get involved there. And vote. Most importantly, vote on Tuesday. Bring 5 friends. We'd really, really encourage you to vote no matter who you're voting for. Get the vote out. Make New Hampshire's voice heard.
Thank you so much, Brian. This absolutely is about making sure that your voice is being heard. So if you like what you heard here today, if you are ready to take a stand for bringing about the systemic change we need to see in our country, to bring about the sea change in our foreign policy in this country so we are getting our priorities straight, if you are ready for a government of, by, and for the people, I invite you to stand with me to join our people-powered campaign. We take no PAC or corporate or lobbyist contributions. Our campaign is purely fueled by people just like yourselves. I need your support. I need your vote. Thank you so much for being here. I'll be able to stick around for some pictures, and if you want to just come up and say hello, they're going to be forming a line on this side of the room.